Okay, thank you very much, Anita, and well, good morning from late evening Spain. And first, I would like to thank very much for inviting me over to this conference, and especially many thanks to Pablo Gregorini. He's not here, but many thanks to him. So it's a pity not to be able to physically enjoy the event and be able to engage on a personal level, but that's how it was now. Well, I leave my personal details in case anyone would like to have further communication with me after my presentation. And well, I'm going to start now. Well, the title is not actually the title that that was presented, because well, this was announced such a long time ago that the title changed in the meantime, and it wasn't changed officially, apparently. So what I'm going to be talking about today is about linking the concept of the GWP STAR and grassland-based livestock systems for climate impact assessments. So I'm going to be talking about climate change. So the main policy context for greenhouse gas emissions and climate change globally is the Paris Agreement. And as most of you will be aware of, this agreement was signed by countries from all around the world in 2016. And among other things, it sets out a global framework to avoid dangerous climate change by limiting global warming to well below 2 degrees Celsius and pursuing efforts to limit it to 1.5 degrees. This implies that the agreement sets stringent temperature goals, and therefore greenhouse gas reductions are required. In concrete terms, the agreement specifies that greenhouse gas emissions need globally to be net zero by 2050. So a little bit more on basics about net zero. The net zero concept is mainly based on the finding that there is a linear relationship between the accumulated amount of emitted carbon dioxide from human sources and the resulting global temperature. This big step change in understanding came from the IPCC fifth assessment report in 2013. From this, it follows that to stabilize temperatures, the net amount of carbon dioxide emitted has to decline to about 0. And this following graph appears in another recent IPCC report. The IPCC special report on the impacts of global warming of 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels and related global greenhouse gas emissions pathways. Well, this graph shows the change in global temperatures relative to the pre-industrial ones times due to the impact of human activities. It shows actually here from 1960. From this, we can see that we are currently above 1 degree Celsius, approximately 1.3, and illustrates for different future emission pathways how temperatures should be responding from now on in order to be able to first stabilize and peak our impact on the temperature on 2050, around this year, and then later trying to actually manage to get even to lower the global temperatures at the end of the century. So the net zero concept for the Paris Agreement has been drawn specifically for CO2 emissions. This was recognized in the Paris Agreement, in which in this 4th article, where it refers to achieving a balance between anthropogenic emissions by sources and removals by sinks of greenhouse gases in the second half of this century. So net zero is clear for carbon dioxide, as it's a gas that is a long-lived gas and it accumulates in the atmosphere for thousands of years. But what happens with methane? Methane is different. Methane is a short-lived gas and stays about a decade in the atmosphere. So therefore, we shouldn't expect there is a similar linear relationship between the methane emissions in a cumulative form and global temperature. So with this, I would put the following example to understand the importance of differentiating CO2 from methane emissions in these kind of setups. So imagine we set up a pathway of emissions for 100 years. According to GWP equivalents, 1 ton of methane would have the same warming potential as about 28 megatons of CO2, or what it would be a megaton of methane. Okay, so we may either keep emissions stable or increase or decrease annually by 0.5% for both CO2 and methane for the same carbon equivalent emissions. For CO2, as previously mentioned, there is a linear relationship between the amount of carbon dioxide emitted in a cumulative form, aggregated, and the resulting temperature. So cumulative CO2 emissions can easily be linked with changes in temperature or CO2 atmospheric concentrations. But how about methane? Does it accumulate as CO2? Well, I have already mentioned it doesn't. So if we accumulate CO2 equivalent emissions, does it accumulate? The fact that it does not accumulate, and therefore there is not such a linear relationship between cumulative CO2 equivalent emissions and temperatures or concentrations of methane in the atmosphere. In fact, stable emissions of methane, because methane has a short life in the atmosphere, means that it will not lead to significant changes in temperatures and concentrations of methane in the atmosphere by these kind of changes that I was illustrating here. So, for example, in green, reducing the rate of methane will actually lead to less warming and lower values of methane concentration in the atmosphere, as compared to what it would happen with CO2, that it would increase either temperatures or CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere. So here in the following graphs, we have the changes since Industrial Revolution of the concentration of the three main greenhouse gases, CO2, methane, and nitrous oxide. So we can see in all of three, they have been increased very substantially, mainly by human activity. So for CO2, if we project to the future the previous scenarios that I was trying to show, we would find that whereas for CO2, neither of these scenarios would make concentrations of the gas stabilize or even go down. If we have the same for methane, to stress the point that I was trying to make before, as a short-lived gas, stable emissions would actually mean that they would be stabilizing methane concentration. And reducing emissions in green would mean that methane this would lead to lowering methane concentration in the atmosphere. For N2O, as a long-lived gas, it would be similar as CO2. So conceptually, trying to really try to illustrate, even in a simpler way, this kind of idea, we have borrowed the analogy of a bathtub and the atmosphere to try to explain the implications of long-lived versus short-lived greenhouse gases and global warming. So we can think of the atmospheric stock of CO2 as a bathtub filled with water. The bath is the atmosphere, the water is the CO2 in the atmosphere. The inflow from the tap is the CO2 emissions, and its drain, it's the limited natural capacity to remove the CO2 from the atmosphere. So before the Industrial Revolution, the inflow equaled the outflow, and the water level was stable, and so was the atmospheric CO2 concentration. What happens with the Industrial Revolution? And we can see it here in the left bath. So the Industrial Revolution tipped over the balance by increasing the inflow, therefore making the levels of atmospheric CO2 rise and rise, leading to the current warming of the world. So in order to stabilize this CO2 in the atmosphere, we need to really close the tap completely, which should require a combination of strategies, among them a fast transition possibly to renewables and cutting down on energy consumption quite a lot. This would be what is meaning net zero CO2 emissions. In the left bathtub is represented methane. So for example, methane from livestock, which is a different story, because methane is rapidly reconverted into the cycle as CO2 for plants, and we can consider that the water outflow is equal to the inflow. So what goes in goes straight out. This is basically because it's a short-lived gas. This obviously can be the case only as long as we don't increase annual methane emissions in the years to come. This has not happened, and that's why the methane and the bathtub of methane has been increasing as well, because methane emissions have been increasing years and years. So up to now, we have seen before that in the framework with temperatures goals, the current metrics, the most common metrics useful for CO2 may lead to some issues when we analyze short-lived gases like methane. So the most standard and used climate metric that I have already mentioned before is the global warming potential, or GWP. The global warming potential was developed to allow comparisons of the global warming impacts of different gases, and specifically it's a measure of how much energy the emissions of 1 ton of gas will absorb over a given period of time relative to the emission of 1 ton of carbon dioxide. The time period usually, conventionally for GWPs is 100 years. Okay, so methane is estimated from the 5th assessment report. That's the latest estimation, that it has a value of about 28 times that from carbon dioxide. So it kind of meaning that it absorbs 28 times more heat over this period compared to carbon dioxide. And for nitrous oxide, the value is 265 times. So GWP is a simplified representation of the impact on radiative forcing, which in turn influences temperature, but it's not really a direct interpretation of temperature changes strictly. To solve the problem about temperature change, especially with the short-lived gases, a new metric denoted GWP star has emerged. It captures methane short-lived behavior by equating a permanent increase of 1 ton per year in the rate of emission of methane with the one-off release of 100 times GWP 100 tons of CO2. This better reflects its climate impacts in pathways scenarios with temperature outcomes, which are the ones, for example, that we are interested in by the Paris Agreement. The equation is as such is shown here. This is just for illustration. So where CO2 equivalence would be equal to by the classic GWP value in CO2 equivalence multiplied by 1, heavily weighted term that considers the change in methane emissions rate, which is the main driver for temperature changes for methane emissions, and a smaller term that is weighted very weakly, and is actually the term that you generally use conventionally with GWP 100. So in this case, if you have a stable methane emission over time that only has weak impact, as opposed to the very large impact of changing your emission rate, increasing it or decreasing it. I'm certainly not an expert on climate metrics, so I'm just a user. So the climate metrics, the more I learn about them, they have more and more nuances. So, well, I really recommend you, if you are more interested about this type of metrics and other metrics. I mean, for GWP star, there is quite a lot of interesting information in these two, at least two. I mean, there are more links where the creators of the metrics explain much better than I have just done myself, and provide much more information. Also, additionally to the use of GWP star and the warming equivalence that you can get from these metrics for methane, you can also use a simple coefficient, which is the TCRE, or which is translated as the transient climate response to cumulative carbon emissions. And this can link cumulative CO2 emissions and temperature as a result of the linear relationship that we have explained from the beginning to do with CO2 cumulative way and temperature global emission global trends. With the GWP star metrics, what we can do that linking warming equivalent, so WE emissions that are resulting from using GWP star from methane. And for long-lived gases as CO2 and N2O, we can do this translation of emissions to temperature by using the equivalent emissions, the standard ones for CO2 using standard GWP 100 equivalences. So coming back to the temperature goals, or indirectly to the concentration of gases in the atmosphere, as they have changed in the last century and beyond, from the pre-industrial revolution times, we can say that these concentrations of the gases in the atmosphere are indirectly or related to the temperatures. So for CO2, stabilizing temperatures would mean possibly decreasing over 1.4 net CO2 emissions annually from now on. For methane, even though livestock already, we have to say that existed in pre-industrial times in some parts of the world, the estimates suggest that it's probable that together with the rice production and also with waste have been one of the main drivers of methane atmospheric growth in the world. There are also other anthropogenic methane sources like fossil fuels, also like wetlands, other natural sources that may have also grown substantially. There is still, unfortunately, large uncertainties associated with these numbers. So for methane concentrations, due to the short life of methane and kind of applying what I have been banging on to up to now, stabilization would imply not changing methane emissions. Okay, so a very different story than for CO2 or even for nitrous oxide, as I previously mentioned, which is also a long-lived gas like CO2 emissions. So when we're talking about methane, we are always, like I said, we're looking at livestock. And when we look at livestock, we can have that those systems associated most with grasslands and with grazing tend to have a much larger share of short-lived gases like methane out of the total carbon footprint of the products. So this is here an example where we can see that for the main grassland-based ruminant systems, as defined by FAO, cattle, buffalo, sheep, and goats. For most species, methane represents over 50% of their carbon footprint, sometimes getting to over 60% for buffaloes and goats. This is globally and for grassland-based systems. So the main sources of this methane comes for grassland-based systems comes from enteric fermentation from the animals. And this is especially relevant for this type of animals as they eat sometimes diets very high in forage with a lot of fiber and sometimes low digestibility in some parts of the world. So the poor quality feed that sometimes would come from marginal land and from it's what is leading to this high methane enteric output. But on the other hand, we need to bear in mind that this marginal land or this land that has this poor quality feed, there is no other type of livestock or even cropping activities that you could have there for food production. So still it's interesting, even though it has large methane enteric fermentation losses. So similarly to species, we can think of production systems that are managed less intensively, which in a lot of cases, again, is synonym of grassland-based or grazed systems in some parts of the world. So these systems would also lead, like similarly to the species I mentioned before, to large methane emissions from enteric fermentation and generally much lower emissions from gases like CO2 coming generally from systems that has low reliance in operations that imply a lot of energy use, fossil fuels, or even inputs that have caused land use change. On the contrary, most intensive livestock systems, and we can think of especially monogastric systems when they are managed intensively, will be mostly responsible for emissions in the form of CO2. and not so much in terms of methane, as I'm showing here in the graph. Both coming from embedded energy use from large amount of inputs required, transport, etc., mostly produced far away from the farm, or associated to land use and land use change. And this typical example would be these very intensive livestock systems that has feeding, imported feeding to the farms that come from regions where forests have been shifted to cropping systems with large CO2 emissions in these operations. So at this stage, I would like to illustrate some examples coming back to the value of the metric GWP star for grassland-based systems where methane losses are large relative to the overall carbon footprint. So in this case, I have two case studies. So my first example, I'm going to have two objectives, and I'm going to use the whole grassland-based livestock systems as defined by FAO and the numbers, the world numbers of these kind of systems. So first one, my first objective is to assess the historical additional warming since 1980 from these particular grassland-based livestock systems, greenhouse gases. And I'm using, again, a carbon footprint approach and not just direct greenhouse gas emissions. So I'm including all of the pre-farm and post-farm emissions as well as the farm emissions. Okay, and as a second task, I would like to estimate the potential of these grassland-based livestock systems to stabilize the additional warming of their greenhouse gases they produce since 2010, and using two time horizons in the future. One would be 2050, another would be 2100. So this is going to be a rough estimate for illustration purposes. So this is something that I haven't published. So and the numbers are not proof for review at the moment, but I think they will be useful for illustration purposes. So for this task, I will start by making this rough estimation of greenhouse gases from 1961 to 2100 based on FAO. 2013 study, which was using outputs from the GLIM model. The methane and N2O emissions from this exercise will be normalized with FAO-STAT emission data changes by the different species. So the FAO-STAT has calculated emissions from 1961 to 2019 and provides two different projections for 2030 and 2050. Also, for simplicity purposes, from 2050, as I didn't have any number, I have assumed that emissions would remain unchanged from the level of 2050. So that's my assumption. It's not that I think this is going to be the truth, but it's just an example and a projection, an example. So I normalize CO2 emissions from energy use and land use change with changes in the animal production data that appears in FAO-STAT. And also, I estimated of course, the GWP star and the additional warming linking the TCRE factor that I previously mentioned with the cumulative CO2 emissions using standard GWP 100 for CO2 and N2O. And I will use GWP star for the gas, the short-lived gas, which is methane. So for assessing the second objective, which is to see the potential of grassland-based livestock to stabilize their additional warming since 2010, I introduced gradually and aggregated one by one 4 types of mitigations, 4 strategies. Also very rough and very, it's all prospective. So the first one was on methane emissions, and where 30% would be reduced against baseline emissions by 2050, and this will be introduced gradually. So it won't be introduced in the first year, but it will be introduced up to 30% this reduction little by little from 2021. And this would be 2050, 30%, and by 55% by 2100. Like I said, it's a prospective case study, so I assume that the emissions reductions would come mainly from improvements in pasture and manure management, but this is just indicated here, and I didn't do a special modeling for a specific accounting for that. So the second mitigation would be for CO2 emissions, and I would be reducing gradually, again, up to 50% by 2050, and up to reducing up to 90% emissions of CO2 by 2073. So from that, those years, I would keep this level of reduction. So you wouldn't get more reduction from these years of compared to the baseline. The first mitigation that I was testing was N2O emissions, and they would be reduced gradually up to 40% by 2060, mainly by improving manure management, fertilization, and grazing management. And the fourth mitigation, the last mitigation, would be a mitigation that would imply reductions in CO2 emissions of 100%. Again, gradually introduced. We would achieve 100% of reduction of CO2 emissions by 2050. And this would be indirectly considering that there could be a reduction in emissions embedded in the energy used, possibly via massive implementation of renewable energy at all scales in the world, and also by increasing soil organic carbon sinks. So it would be altogether considered. So for each of the species, I developed the emission pathway for historic emissions. Each gas and FAO projection until 2050 as well. I would show here. So this is for grassland-based buffalo systems here. The following one would be for dairy cattle systems. I'm not stopping, as it's not really the objective of the study to go to look at the different species specifically. So it's just to show you that I did the work. The next one is for grassland-based non-dairy cattle systems. So this is the emissions for each of the gases and years. This is for grassland-based sheep systems, and the last one for grassland-based goat systems here. So when I integrate all of the emissions for all the species, overall, the majority of the carbon footprint this is no surprise, because that's already something that I already mentioned, and this FAO data, so it's nothing surprising here. So most of the carbon footprint is associated with enteric and manure methane emissions. This number would be slightly over 50%. About 25-26%, depending on the year, of the carbon footprint would be associated with the N2O emissions from manure management, grazing, or fertilization. And about the rest, between 24 and 25% of the total carbon footprint would be associated with CO2 emissions from fossil fuel use and land use change. CO2 emissions have been increasing at a higher rate, about 1.6 annually, compared with methane and N2O emissions, which also have been increasing year to year, about the rate of 1.3%. But this is just numbers, and it's just to give a small glimpse of what was happening here with the global emissions of grassland-based livestock systems. So when we apply the framework to estimate the additional warming, we found out that for the period 1980 to 2019, the grassland-based livestock activity and its associated LCA-based greenhouse gas emissions has resulted in about 30 milli-degrees Celsius added temperature to the temperature that we're adding from the 1980 year. Okay, so this is separated in the effect that it would cause methane. So up to this level, N2O and CO2, and this is the aggregated additional warming from 1980 that these three gases from grassland-based livestock systems have caused worldwide. In terms of future pathways of emissions, our assumed baseline will lead to these changes in emissions for each greenhouse gas form. So green CO2, in blue methane, and in red N2O, and for the 2050 and 2100 horizons. This all expressed in megatons CO2 equivalents per year. This grassland-based livestock activity and its associated LCA-based greenhouse gas emissions would result, once we do the GWP star and the aggregated emissions and the TCR and the associated warming, added warming, would result in about 40 millidegrees for the 2050 horizon, and 84 millidegrees for the 2100 horizon. So this is the baseline of that I'm considering. So now I'm going to show the mitigations and how they relate to this baseline that I have estimated for grassland-based livestock systems in the world. So our first mitigation, and I remind you that is the one on methane emissions, will lead to these changes in emissions. So see these dotted blue lines. So this is the alternative scenario now, where we are introducing this this mitigation for methane. So we have this for 2050, and we have this pathway for 2100. So this mitigation pathway and its associated LCA-based greenhouse gas emissions would result in about 25% and 35% lower added temperature in the atmosphere for the 2050 and the 2100 horizons compared to the baseline. So the baseline would be this shape, and the new scenario would be now in yellow, where we were mitigating methane emissions. Our second mitigation was on CO2 emissions, and I was aggregating the scenario from before. So this scenario is also considering the methane mitigation that I previously showed. And in this scenario, I'm introducing as new the scenario where we are reducing CO2 emissions. So this is in blue dotted lines, in dotted green lines in this case. And this is for 2050, and this is for 2100. So again, this mitigation pathway would result in about 29% now and 48% now lower added temperature in the atmosphere for 2050 and 2100. Again, I'm showing well the baseline and the one with one mitigation compared to the one in yellow, which is now the one that has two mitigation strategies altogether. So my third mitigation measure was adding to the previous ones, the methane and the CO2, the one on N2O emissions. And it was specifically for the one for N2O emissions is the one shown here in red for 2050 and 2100 horizons. This is the dotted red lines, the ones that are showing the pathways that I'm simulating here. And this mitigation pathway with the three added aggregated mitigations would result in 33 and 58% reduction in the additional warming associated for 2050 to 2100. And finally, the last mitigation, our last mitigation was aggregating to the third previous one, and well, to the two previous ones for N2O and methane. We were adding a new one on CO2, which was what we call a net zero CO2 scenario, where we would get to zero net CO2 emissions by 2050. And this is shown in green for 2050 here, and 2100. That's when you can see actually very clearly how it gets to zero net CO2 emissions in 2050 here. So the resulting cumulative warming would be here again in yellow. So again, 41%, so it's a much lower impact on additional warming, and almost 70% for the 2100 horizon. So what we can see here is that in this scenario, and only in this very stringent scenario, we can see that the added temperature, and we can see it here in this 2100 horizon, the added temperature is getting close to stabilizing by 2050. For further really reduction of this additional warming, even reversing some of the warming that was before created, it would be required much further reduction in emissions. Okay, so as the second and last case study, I chose a comparison in monogastric species, so in pig systems, and this is a kind of a paradigmatic case in Spain. So we have in one side, we have one of the greatest extremes in terms of intensity on the largest intensity. So we are leaders in industrial pork production. The share actually of this total pork production in Spain is above 95% of the total pig production. So this kind of systems are characterized by a production with fast fattening of the animals in very large and highly technological farms, where the animals are housed and there is high density. There is no territorial base, there's no land associated to these farms, and which generally generates a very important problem of manure management. In this other picture, this is a peak of a completely extreme in terms of intensity. It's a very intensive system. It's called Montanera system. It's pig breeding in kind of a silvopastoral type of system. The breeds are different. They are called Iberian pigs and are raised, and they are in this as a extensive way, and it consists of letting the pig graze in this type of Mediterranean pastures, where the traditional fattening takes place among forests of cork oaks and holm oaks. The acorn, which is the fruit of some of these trees, is one of the main feed before the slaughter for the animals. So in this type of systems, in opposition, as opposed to the intensive production systems, these Iberian pigs live in freedom in the space, graze there, remain in movement, which is the base of the quality of their meat. So in terms of low density, well, it's as low as more or less each pig would require approximately one hectare of this type of pasture. So for this case study, the objective of the study was to compare two scenarios where pig consumption in Spain is reduced to half. So according to some statistics, we are eating about 25 kilograms of pig products per person. So both scenarios are trying to lead to a reduction to half of this consumption, so from 25 to 12.5 kilograms of pork per person and per year by the year 2040. And this is done by reducing consumption gradually of this product. And we have two different scenarios. One where the reducing consumption is keeping unchanged the relative contribution of each of the production systems in Spain. So it's about 95% for the very industrial and 5% for the extensive systems. So we are reducing to half of the production and half of the consumption from both systems. And another scenario contrasting would be reducing the same amount of pork consumption in Spain per capita, but we would be gradually increasing year to year the contribution of this extensive production, the Montanera production, compared with the pork produced as intensive. So this would imply that we need to increase our production in these silvopastoral systems and decrease the production in terms of the very much a lot of the industrial systems. So here what I'm showing is the graphs representing the carbon footprint of meat from industrial and from confined systems compared with pigs produced under these silvopastoral Montanera practices. So the industrial production system of pork involves large emissions in the form of CO2, like I mentioned before, intensive systems. So a lot of the emissions embedded in the carbon footprint have to do with CO2 emissions, mostly, like I mentioned before, associated to energy use in the farm or outside for the embedded emissions from transport, production, manufacturing, etc., or also associated to land use and land use change, generally through imported feed. And this is quite an issue in Spain, and I would suspect in a lot of places in Europe and in the world. So on the contrary, the Montanera systems, the extensive systems, the pig production emits most of their emissions in terms of methane emissions. And this is coming from mainly from manure management. So overall, the industrial system has a larger carbon footprint associated to the production of 1 kilogram of pig meat. And these differences are even larger, and you can see it here, when you include the potential soil organic carbon and the carbon from tree biomass that the Montanera system, the extensive systems, the silvopastoral systems are capable of capturing, and as it has been identified by these different studies. Well, I should say here as a disclaimer is that this case study is based on 2 studies. And the values obviously are subject to the uncertainties that are associated to these 2 studies. So this is again for illustration purposes using these 2 studies. Not sure if this will be the difference if you run other experiments or other life cycle analysis, but that's what they got from these studies. So in this following graph, I can show you the impact of the additional warming by using GWP star and using the GWP conventional and linking that to temperatures, added temperatures. And this is the additional warming caused by a gradual reduction in consumption in Spain of pork by 50% by 2040. This would be, in blue would be the result assuming a consumption pattern that is like the same as now. So mostly is pork from industrial systems. And in an alternative scenario, where there is a transition to higher consumption of pork from extensive systems, you would have in a scenario which much lower warming associated to the system, to the consumption. So this is an interesting output, and this is actually showing that it would be interesting to shift our and promote especially these ecosystems that are associated with these silvopastoral systems that actually have been abandoned in the last decade. So that's obviously the next question that someone would make: if we have enough land to have this type of production systems. I'm not sure if we have enough land, but certainly we have a lot of land that has been abandoned and potentially that could be recovered to implement this kind of strategy. So now I come already to the conclusions and to the final slide. So to sum up, I would say that in my presentation, I have shown that the ruminant grassland-based livestock systems, like any other systems in the economy, should reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and that's part of the Paris Agreement. And one option could be aligning the strategy to temperature goals. Also, I have shown, and we already knew, but I mean, ruminant livestock contributes to greenhouse gas emissions to a large extent in terms of methane, which is a short-lived gas. And the more extensive the system, the greater the proportion the methane it emits. And since these short-lived emissions show different dynamics than CO2 emissions, it's understandable, as I believe New Zealand has done. They should be considered in CO2, N2O, and compared with methane separately in climate plans and consider with the global temperature targets separately. Alternatively, we can use this new metric, the GWP START, that can help to integrate methane with other long-lived gases and align pathways of emissions with goals of stabilization and beyond on reducing global temperatures. And I have shown two different examples of grassland-based systems as an illustration purpose that I hope it has helped for this. So with that, I just finished my presentation. I wait for questions now and leave my coordinates here in case there's still questions after this this conference. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Agustin. That was really, really interesting. I'll just start off the questions and then I'll let other people ask. The first question I wanted to ask you about was just around the practical applicability of some of those scenarios that you talked about, particularly in the first case study, and just how realistic is it to achieve those differences that you talked about, and also, like, because in New Zealand, obviously our soil carbon is quite high already, so how realistic are those scenarios in different locations where for instance, soil carbon might already be that high?
Okay, yeah, it will depend on the not just location, but I think mainly on production system as well, because I mean, like the example of New Zealand, even though it's a grassland-based system, it's quite more intensive than other places in the world. So, for example, for New Zealand, I'm sure that in terms of methane, I'm sure there's going to be a lot of interest for the use of additives. So, I mean, this every day, on and on, you get, I mean, New Zealand or other places in the States, Canada, in Europe, you hear every day on and on in the news a different, either the red algae or 3-Nop, etc. And there is always a new study and there is a lot of promises, and some are possibly closer to be available commercially. So for methane, that's clear that that's one promising aspect. Not sure how much you could get to reduce. I mean, for red algae, it's getting crazy, the promises, but it still has to be scaled and everything. For those systems that are more linked with marginal land, so I would think of more extensive or well, places like in Africa or in South America in some areas, I think additives possibly won't be a solution. So then you have possibly more opportunities that have to do with the improving pastures and improving the digestibility of the pastures in some of these places, especially if it's not marginal land. Actually, if it's a land that is not because I think in marginal land, it's obviously not much you manage. It's just you take the most of whatever you find there, and you try to manage as best as possible. For N2O, you would have as well for more intensive system. You would have as well, like New Zealand was trying, but possibly it has stopped with the nitrification inhibitors, but then management of fertilizer, management of grazing management, a lot of can be done with the manure management as well to reduce N2O emissions. Some of the numbers I have to say that are still globally used or by many people, even by FAO, has not updated the emission factors from the latest IPCC 2019 refinement, which would actually lead to much lower N2O emissions from grazing or from manure application. And obviously for CO2 is the obvious promise that there is going to be the one for energy use is going to be an obvious one that has to do with renewable energies and things like that. But obviously, if that doesn't happen, nothing will happen, because CO2 needs to lead really the strategy. That would be my understanding. Sorry, I have been too long.
No, that's all right. No, that answers it. But I was just wondering, like, so what about production in your scenarios, does that did you have to reduce production in order to make those achievable, or?
I didn't specify that, but obviously production could be. You mean from the consumption side, leading to production, or?
I guess both. I mean, obviously, production consumption of livestock products is going to increase, but also in terms of like increasing animal efficiency to meet those production targets, is that a factor that you considered, or are you just assuming that we're going to be able to reach sort of a certain level?
Yeah, I think that's. I mean, I didn't explicitly took it into account, but obviously there is still some scope to reduce, to improve efficiency. From that point of view, but I mean, but bear in mind that for some places, I mean, this has been already tried. Like if I would think of Africa, places like that, that there are international projects that come to Africa, to some areas, with the objective to increase animal efficiency. But obviously, ignoring in a way the context of feed over there, the availability of feed. I mean, you can improve the breeding to a certain extent in relation to the availability of feed and the quality of feed that you will be able to afford, or you will be able to access. And there has been some failure cases, because that was an I think it was an overestimation of how much they were going to get from breeding in some of these areas, without considering the need to really have a very solid strategy for feed availability, good feed, and in these places it's not really easy.
Okay, so the next question I had is around, like, from what you sort of explained, and I don't have a great understanding of global warming potential or environmental pollution, but from what you were sort of saying, that methane is not necessarily as bad as what sort of people think that it is. So in New Zealand, but pastoral farms have kind of been villainized, I would say, because they contribute 50% of New Zealand's global warming. Gas production is from methane from livestock. So I'm just wondering, why is it, do you think, that people have such a negative idea of methane versus CO2?
Well, I mean, I'm not saying that methane is not I mean, it's a big problem, which is, I think it's still a big problem. I think what it has not been considered in the last possibly decades, last 2 decades, is because we have been using very freely, like we have been adopting this GWP 100. That is a very useful thing to integrate 3 very different gases in this case. I mean, especially this lifetime of gases in the atmosphere is what it makes the big difference. It's not about being the bad one or the good one. It's about when we are having now specific temperature targets for the future. Changes in emissions from CO2 or from methane, the same rate will do very different things to what we would have thought, thinking in the framework, conventional framework, to just say, well, 1 ton of methane equals 28 tons of CO2. Well, it's not as simple as that when you transfer that into a pathway of emissions. So it very much depends if it grows, if it goes down. Plus, I mean, I think to be honest, I think a lot of the nuances, which are really a lot behind this and behind livestock production, has been erased. So we tend to get a lot very simplified messages, which without the nuances, well, it gets to polarize very much whether one thing is good or bad. I think we are in a gray area, and well, methane, it's a greenhouse gas that is very powerful, and is very useful to reduce methane, to also to help get into our targets of the Paris Agreement. But certainly we cannot go to a strategy where we would be thinking of reducing 100% CO2 from fossil fuels should equate to reducing 100%, for example, of methane emissions, which is actually impossible, because we are talking about anyway emissions that are fully linked to human activity in terms of fossil fuels, and livestock, which is linked to human activities, but partly is connected to semi-natural and biological processes. So it's not as easy as for CO2 from fossil fuels.
How realistic is the Paris Agreement? Do you think? I mean, you sort of mentioned that we're still increasing our CO2 emissions every year. Do you think that is actually going to change anytime soon?
Well, I mean, I think it has been great times for experiments in these kind of things, like with the COVID. You know, we had 1 year and a half with limited movement and with with great reductions in CO2 emissions from fossil fuels, and we have seen that has not had any impact on the CO2 concentrations. Why? Because it's a long-lived gas. So, like I said in the example of the bathtub, you need to absolutely reduce almost to zero, and we are very far from that. So, unless there is a full deployment of new technology and changes in lifestyle, I don't know. That's more difficult, I suppose. Or just we don't travel like we do now, because we don't travel because of the circumstances. But once we come back, I'm sure we will. Come back to traveling, and it's going to be difficult to stop CO2 from that. So
yeah, it seems to be a big contributor as well, from what I've read. So have you considered the role of grassland plant species for sequestering carbon? Is there a role for sort of introducing different plants into certain rangelands to increase the amount of carbon that's actually taken up by soil?
Yeah, I'm actually involved in, I mean, I'm not an experimentalist myself, but yeah, I've been working with some people. I'm engaged in one project with some British partners that have been testing mixed swards, for example. So introducing a little bit more biodiversity in the pastures to first see whether this actually changes the quality of the pasture. Secondly, it also changes things on the soil, so possibly potentially either increasing a little bit soil organic carbon or leading to less emissions from N2O and certainly from methane from enteric fermentation. So I've been involved and I actually have this summer to work on that field. So it's something that is becoming quite interesting, at least in Europe. I don't know if in New Zealand this is something that you are, but I mean, at least in Europe, I know several groups that are testing, and they are finding this improvement by bringing some biodiversity in the pastures. And reducing emissions, and actually also improving productivity. So it's a kind of a win-win situation. So not sure how realistic that is in terms of scaling that to everyone, but that's what I know from the tests that they're doing.
And in New Zealand, there's sort of been a big movement towards what's called regenerative agriculture, being that these certain plant species or a mixture of plant species can be sown to sort of improve carbon sequestration, although there hasn't been a lot of experimental evidence to sort of support these findings, and particularly in New Zealand, where, as I said before, the soil carbon is already quite high. So there's a lot of sort of movement around that at the moment, but yeah, there's not really any information to sort of support it yet. One thing I was just wondering, in one of your slides, you sort of compared the different, like the carbon footprint of greenhouse gases versus like cattle versus sheep and buffaloes. And I noticed that N2O contributed over, what was it, 40% in sheep. And I was just wondering, why is that when sort of like beef or cattle were only around 24%? Why is it so much higher?
I think it has to do with the really large emissions associated to CO2 for beef in terms of globally. I mean, this is coming especially from I think from South America, so all has to do with land use change. But this has to do with that. If you look at the different regions, it will be very different results, because there won't be as much CO2, and therefore for beef, I mean, so therefore the N2O emissions would come up actually larger in the mix.